Okay, so we're going to move on to our second session today, which is Left Behind Places, Improving Wellbeing in Neighbourhoods Experiencing Greater Deprivation. So the second panel will look to address regional inequalities within levelling up, with a focus on place-based deprivation and the role of infrastructure in this. With the levelling up agenda rolled out to reduce geographical disparities in the UK, the approach thus far has been centralised and fragmented. The UK has been described as almost certainly the most interregional, unequal, large, high-income country. And in light of this, significant differences among cities have become apparent, with post-industrial and rural areas sidelined to prioritise development in larger urban cities, such as London. Different left behind places have been identified in the UK, so cities outside of London and the southeast, coastal towns, districts and disadvantaged rural communities. And here, left behind neighbourhoods are understood as areas that experience a mix of high ranking on the indices of multiple deprivation, poor social infrastructure, and economic stagnation. So we're joined today, I'm delighted that we're joined by Lucy Dixon, who's the Head of External Affairs from Karbon Homes. We also have Daniel Paterson, who's the Director of External Affairs at Make UK Modular. And finally, we have Nicholas Boyce-Smith, who is the Director from the Create Streets Foundation. So if we can start with Lucy, if that's okay. And we'll follow a similar format as before. Please use the chat function if you have any comments or questions, and we'll hopefully be able to get to those. And over to you, Lucy, for your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Paula, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. So just a little bit of background. Karbon Homes are a housing association based in the North East, but we have around 32,000 homes across the North East and Yorkshire. Some of those homes will be in areas that are well connected, that have vibrant local economies and strong community and public services, but many of our homes are in areas that would be characterised as left behind, areas where they've seen industrial and structural decline, have poor transport links, there's insecure work, and the unintended consequences of tax and poverty benefits have basically left people living there trapped in cycles of poverty. And we see our role as a housing association to help shape strong, sustainable places for our communities, and that includes tackling and reducing inequalities. And I just wanted to use my opening remarks to talk about some research that we've done over the last couple of years, looking into how we can best tackle that work as a housing association. So we've done some in-depth research into two specific areas in our geographical patch, areas where we have a large number of homes and which would be characterised as left behind. And we did that in order to really understand and get to grips with the challenges that people who live there, our customers, face, and to also understand what interventions we could make that would have a real impact on reducing some of those inequalities. The two areas that we have looked at are Stanley, where we have about 1 in 4 of all homes in Stanley. It's a former coal mining town you may be familiar with, in Durham. There are limited job opportunities in the town, a declining high street and poor transport links. The other area is Byker, a very different community, but equally often characterised as left behind. It's a diverse community east of Newcastle city centre. Historically, it's faced multiple challenges and currently has among the highest levels of deprivation in the country in terms of income, employment, health and education. Just to give you an example of what that means for people living there, currently the healthy life expectancy of a 55-year-old man living in Byker is around 63.8 years, and that's more than 11 years less than those living in more affluent northwest of Newcastle. So you can see the impact living in the area has on people's life chances. And both of the areas that we've looked at face multiple challenges, slightly different in each area, as every area is unique. But in both cases, it affects the life chances of people who live there and limits their opportunities to prosper. When we've done this research, we've also looked at previous levelling up policies, and we know that various governments over the years have put, a lot of money and investment into levelling up, and there's certainly been no lack of political will, and certainly in recent years it has come back on the agenda again. But these policies have yet to really work in those communities. They focus primarily on increasing GVA, on creating more jobs and better jobs with higher income, and basically on increasing economic productivity in cities and urban areas in the hope that it trickles down into the surrounding, maybe more rural or smaller towns and villages. And we've seen in practice that just hasn't worked. And the areas that we work in, including Stanley and Byker, but others as well, there's been a real lack of investment in infrastructure, including transport and housing, for many years. In particular, we looked, the research we did, which we undertook with some group of academics as well as a number of other organisations. Our research found that that real focus on better jobs, higher jobs, more higher gross income for people in those areas hasn't really led to benefits for people living there. So our research found, for example, that a 2-adult, 2-children household with income from work and benefits of around £31,500, if that household doubled its gross income through one of the adults getting a job or getting more hours or getting a higher paid job, they'd actually only see around 20% of that increase in terms of their disposable income after tax and benefits. And that's without taking into account the additional costs that they might incur through transport or childcare, which are almost inevitable if you're going into employment or you're getting a better paid job. It's often further away. So looking at all that research and looking at the impact of what we think we've seen from previous levelling up policies, our research led us to a different approach, one that focuses on the foundational economy and on strengthening the foundational economy. We've called it Fair Foundations, and it basically looks on strengthening the essential goods and services that people need for everyday life. So that might be food, health and housing, utilities, etc., but also on increasing residual household income rather than on gross income. And we see our role as a housing association and basically an anchor institution in the areas that we work in as vital in strengthening the foundation economy. And we've identified, and we're prioritising right now, a series of interventions that will help us both strengthen the foundation economy and increase residual household income for our customers and wider residents in those areas. I must stress that we're just still really near the beginning of our journey. We've done a lot of research, but in terms of seeing the impact, we're still in the early days. But just to give you a flavour of what the kinds of things we're doing, which are probably a bit different to what we and other housing associations have done in the past, which has tended to be more focused on the sharp end relieving crisis. This approach is looking at kind of really trying to tackle the causes and intervene earlier on. So some examples of what we're looking to do. We've focused our apprenticeships on our customers and particularly targeted at those in the areas, the most deprived areas in our communities. We've invested in employability support, specifically targeted in the 2 areas I mentioned. So we've introduced a paid placement scheme called New Start, which offers 5-month paid placements for people in those areas who are quite far away from their labour market or who have been economically inactive for a long time. And that has a twofold effect. It gets people into work and gets people earning a wage, but it also allows local businesses to employ someone at no cost to themselves for 5 months to get them up to speed and grow as a business, and therefore strengthening the area. So it might be a local shop on the high street, a local small business that then can start to grow by having those placements there and eventually going on to employ those people and more. We've looked at providing out-of-hours childcare support for people. So that's holiday clubs that have free activities and free lunches. Looking at more social housing in certain areas, so it's better quality housing and cheaper than private rented, so that gives people more money in their pockets. We've recently bought an old derelict board school on Stanley High Street. We'll be looking to work with local authority, local businesses, other local public services and community organisations to create a mixed residential / community / commercial space in the bid to kind of increase the footfall on the high street and really regenerate the area. And we're doing things like investing in decarbonisation in our homes to reduce energy costs, and focusing any work that we do on using local businesses to strengthen the local supply chains. So these are a range of things that we can do, but we also think other housing associations can do and are doing, and other anchor institutions can do. So it's something that it's a different approach that people can take to trying to level up in their own communities. But we know we can't do it alone, and we do need changes in government policy. And I won't go into detail right now, but we need more investment in social housing. We need greater subsidies of public transport in left behind areas so they've got better transport links. We welcome the greater devolution of powers and funding to a more local level where people know the areas and can make decisions that are best for those areas. And we need more grant funding for refurbishment and retrofitting of existing homes in order to improve the quality of people's lives and people's health and well-being. So that's just a quick summary of the work we're doing, and obviously happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And we'll have an opportunity when we've heard from the other two panellists for questions. So we're now going to move on to hear from Daniel Paterson, who is the Director of External Affairs at Make UK Modular. Hi, Daniel.
Hello, thank you very much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try and avoid death by PowerPoint here. But I've got a few slides I want to just talk through in terms of, I suppose, how we're approaching areas around this subject. I just wanted to start very quickly there with, because I understand some people on the call are aware of what Modular is. I think Richard spoke in the first session about a business, I believe, deals with Panellists Modular. I just really wanted to talk about what Modular is. When it comes to Modular, what is it? It's essentially a house, commercial or municipal building, exactly like you're sat in at the moment. The sole difference is that essentially it's created in a factory setting on an assembly line, and then it's taken to site and it's assembled there. Now, the image you can see there is what we call a 3D modular building. Essentially, that is where the full superstructure, all four walls and ceilings and internal walls are done in a factory and then taken to site and then plugged together. The other side of it, as I mentioned, is panelized, which is a little bit more like flat pack, if I can put it that way. You take the walls, you take the ceilings, and you put it together at site with the windows and all the fittings already in. It's really important to, I think, just address very quickly why there is a demand for modular and where it's coming from. The first thing to say is it really coming out of the growing crisis within the construction industry labour market. Make UK had we published Make Modular published a report earlier this year that reckoned that we will by 2030 need to recruit over 950,000 workers. Now, that is to address the skills that we need to address in terms of new skills, but it's also backfill for backfill retirees. That's a huge number to fill, and in the last year we did about 11,000 apprenticeships from a construction sector point of view. So we need to make better use of our labour market. The second is the vital necessity of meeting our net zero commitments. With the net zero commitments, of course, meeting those commitments, we can also talk about affordability, which has been, of course, unfortunately, over the course of the past year, a particular problem. The third thing is, of course, the current housing crisis and the demand for genuinely affordable homes. We're in a position at the moment where it's not just a question of people not being able to buy a home, but they're not able to rent a home or heat it either. Modular builders can complete projects at pace without loss of quality. Essentially, that's coming from the manufactured type of assembly line processes that are used. Think about it like constructing a Mercedes E-Class. Just because you're putting out more on the assembly line, it doesn't mean to say that the quality is decreasing. From that, you're also getting an increase in productivity within a sector that has seen low productivity growth over the course of the last 30 years. It's also, as I said, using labour in a smarter way, which is absolutely essential if we're going to break the back of this issue. The final thing to say is the economic model of modular is to ensure that factories do not experience downtime, which means that they need to continue building housing, which is a part of the solution. In order to make housing more affordable, I think it's fair to say we need to incentivise building and the building of appropriate types of housing. Modular does this. I'm not saying it is modular is the be all and end all to all of the issues that we are facing in housing, but it can contribute towards squaring some of the circles. How does modular do this? Well, manufacturers have permanent overheads. They need to keep a factory running. They need to pay permanently employed skilled workers. They have costs that traditional builders don't contend with. As a consequence, they need to keep building. It could be seen as a problem, and frankly, where there are blockages in the system and projects are held up, it can be, but it can actually be the basis for a solution to the issue of a poor supply in building, particularly in a downturn. While traditional builders are economically perhaps not incentivized to reduce output in a downturn, so rather to incentivize to reduce output in a downturn, I beg your pardon, the modular builders need to keep delivering. The basic economics, the business model demands consistent turnover. We have seen with the Affordable Homes Programme some successes over the course of the last few years. And if I'm being totally truthful with you, it has been a driver behind modular, behind particularly 3D modular. But I think it's fair to say that there's more to do in the next programme. We can deliver, modular builders can deliver homes that are more affordable and more social rented homes that are more affordable to live in through speed of delivery. Part of it is to do with the fact that we can deliver a quicker return on investment for social rented properties. In some cases, we're talking about 16 to 20 week build times, which is well below 6-month build time for a traditional build house. That means you're getting the social rents in quicker, which means that there is greater return investment quicker in order to turn the next projects round. The last thing I would say for my final slide is it's not just about the affordability of the rent and the purchase price. It's about the affordability of the place to live in. Because if we can improve the affordability of where people live, I think it was alluded to earlier by another one of the panelists, talking about that quality of life, being able to use every home and room in the home. It increases that quality of life, it increases their life chances, people's life chances, and it increases local economic development, which is, I think, fair to say, absolutely critical within this conversation. From our point of view, we're trying to be fairly conservative in our approach to our recommendations. The first thing to say is that actually increasing allocation of the Affordable Homes Programme for modular. We talked about creating a pipeline that is economically viable. One way of doing that is to encourage modular through the Affordable Homes Programme. We've already seen some growth through it already. I think we can see some more growth through it if companies and investors know that there's a guaranteed pipeline there. The second is, we saw earlier this summer the announcements by Mr. Gove, the Secretary of State, in regards to investment on dealing with planning issues, particularly in resourcing. This is encouraging, and I think it's fair to say it's certainly better to have that than not. But we think that what is absolutely vital here is we generate the next generation of talent, the pipeline of talent, not for 1 year, not for 2 years, but over a parliament at the very least. We think about 19.4 million, about 20 million pounds, really looks at apprenticeships for about 400 planning assistants, about 120 new planning officers, which would be a substantial increase into the system. This isn't just money to pay people more, it's for apprenticeships in these areas. And then on top of that, actually 50% again to focus on those places that have been left behind that we'd like to level up. An additional 10 million. And I think there's a number of ways we could look at this, but what we have discussed internally here is really looking at the below average per capita income by comparison to the region that they live in, that people live in. Because if we can crack that nut, we can help to increase local tax bases, perhaps not by a lot, but by some. And if we can help to increase local tax bases and tax returns from that, we can help economic development. I'm going to shut up at that point. And if you've got questions, I'd love to take them. Hope that is giving you an insight as to where we're coming from. It's not a magic bullet. It's not going to solve everything, but I think it is part of the puzzle in order to address some of the things we're talking about today.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Daniel. That was really interesting, and I'm sure we'll have some questions when we've heard from our final panelist today, Nicholas Boyce-Smith, who is the director of Create Streets Foundation. So over to you, Nicholas.
Paula, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I know a couple of you, so it's lovely to see you. I think lovely to see you in the Zoom room because I'm sitting in a tiny little room here in D-Luck, which is not a very nice place to be. So I'd much rather focus on all of you than focus on this rather unpleasant place I'm in right now. If I may, and with slight apologies to Daniel, who I might slightly irritate, so forgive me, Daniel, I'm going to say two very quick things on some of the really interesting evidence, both from Daniel and from Richard before, just to chuck it in there and get you thinking. First thing, just on the environment point, what Richard said about the importance of energy in use versus embodied carbon is really important, and I think didn't quite follow through into the conversation you subsequently had. Just to give you a fact, the energy embodied in a Victorian semi-detached house would drive a car 10 times around the world. If you knock it down and replace it with the most energy efficient building you can imagine, you would knock down between 80 and 100 years of embodied carbon, and it would take you a century to catch up. That's not to say you shouldn't sometimes do that, but the energy embodied in our existing built environment is incredibly important to the debate on living sustainably and how we use energy. And the second thing, which didn't, I think, come into the conversation, maybe it wasn't in the questions you asked them, so maybe it's safe to say, no criticism, they're both clearly very, very expert, is how we move around in our quotidian existence. This goes to the ULEZ debate currently happening in London. If for every single daily use you need to jump in a car, your energy impact is massively higher than if it is natural and easy to walk or cycle or go around the corner to see your friends or do that. So I thought those was really first order issues that weren't quite in that first discussion, other than Richard brilliant in the front. So forgive me, I know you haven't asked me that, I'm going to chuck it in there anyway. And secondly, if I may, and with apologies to Daniel, who I'm about to irritate, nothing against Modular, some of my clients are Modular, so all for Modular. However, until we sort out the very peculiar way that we run our planning system in this country with very high levels of planning risk, very high levels of planning uncertainty, because we have a development control-led system rather than a regulatory plan-led system, it'll be very, very hard, however much money government throws at it, to fix essentially the high fixed cost business model of Modular. And all attempts to do it haven't. Ilkley Homes, one of the big ones, just went bust the other day. Top Hat was sold to Goldman Sachs for I don't know how many millions, is tanking. So nothing against Modular, but until you won't get there, and you shouldn't even try until you sort out elements of planning, which I wasn't planning to go into, but just to flag that. And Daniel, by all means, come back and nonsense everything I've just said. I won't mind at all. And I say that in the spirit of being constructively provocative rather than disagreeing. I'm all for Modular. I'm going to say three things. So if you don't want to listen to me or you don't like what you're hearing so far, you can turn off after the next 30 seconds. So first thing, do not believe the calumny that is put about by some that place is in the eye of the beholder. That is provably not true. the types of places that people want to be is very measurable, and there are clear and consistent correlations in this country, and again, across all countries. There is some level of cultural specificity, but remarkably little, between how much, where you live, how much you walk, the air you breathe, how happy you feel, how content you feel, how in control of your life. So there's really important stuff here in terms of levelling up in place. Point one. Point two, that then feeds through, and this rhymes a lot, I think, with the important stuff Lucy was saying. When you then start thinking about levelling up, yes, you need to worry about jobs. Yes, you need to worry about big infrastructure, but you can't just worry about those, particularly in a Zoom economy world where people get more choice as to where they live. You need to create the economics of place attraction. Otherwise, as we're beginning to see in places like Great Yarmouth or Grimsby, where there is new economic activity in offshore wind and the like, a lot of the money is just flowing straight through and going somewhere else. And by the way, the good news is that's a much cheaper way of actually doing regeneration. It's easier to plant street trees, improve the place, than it is to build a motorway. And then third thing, I'll get to some policy proposals, which I won't actually go through in huge detail, because I've written, and indeed one of them with Carbon Homes, written lots of reports on this. So I'll direct you to them rather than giving you death by 55 policy proposals. Next slide, please. So just a few quick thoughts, and this is almost impressionistic, because again, I could do hours on this. I've got books on this, but just to give you a little bit of nuance and detail on the importance of place. There is incredibly strong, consistent data in this country, in Canada, in several European countries on the positive correlations and in some evidence causations between more street trees and good well-being outcome for residents. They're associated with more walking, with cars driving slower, particularly if they come out into the carriageway, with fewer accidents, cleaner air, better residents' health, and in one study with knowing more of your neighbours. And as you probably know, the ONS did good work on this a couple of years ago now. There are staggeringly fewer street trees in poorer areas. So, there's no miracle cure in this world. And anyone who says there are, you should disbelieve. The closest you get to plant more street trees. And I'm very pleased that I managed to get into the NPPF a few years ago, a requirement on that for new street trees, but really put focus on that. That's a clear evidence place. Next slide, please. Another key one, and this is relevant to current debates in London, traffic. So traffic's good in the sense that we want to and need to move around. That's half the point of living in a town or a city. But very high levels, or indeed modest high levels, of vehicular traffic, as well as associated with poor air, that may change with new technology, are also associated with knowing fewer of your neighbours. This is a fascinating study done in 1977 by Brian Appleyard. It's recently been replicated in Bristol about 5 years ago. Those three streets that you can see slightly hazily mapped out in front of you are morphologically similar streets in the US. One has got heavy traffic, or at least did in 1977. One has got moderate traffic, and one has got light traffic. There's a slight covariance in the data in that residents on the lightly trafficked streets tend to stay living there for longer. But those lines you can see are maps of friendship, and you can see what's going on. On the heavily trafficked streets, people know fewer of their neighbours. And the consistent evidence is that if we know our neighbours, as long as we can choose when we speak to them, that's basically good for our personal well-being, as well as obviously supporting community and colo action. So again, that's a clear relationship. And I should say, I'll come to this later, some of the fastest and the nastiest roads in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and indeed more recently, got pushed through the less prosperous bits of towns and places because their residents there were not able to stop them. When they started building the motorway box in London that led to the fall of the 1970s Tory GLC, they started building it, guess what, in the East End and in the poor bits. And when they moved to the West, that's when the whole thing collapsed politically. Another one, I love this one. There's good Danish, one Australian, and also a Dutch study, which shows, this is actually from one of our projects in Grimsby. If you've got modest front gardens, similar to the size you can see in the picture in front of you, that's associated with knowing, it comes back to my point earlier, that's associated with knowing your neighbours better and interacting with them more. If you've got no front gardens, there's no reason to be out there pruning your roses. If you've got a huge front garden where you're going to be hidden behind the acacia tree or whatever it might be, but a modest front garden like this where you might sit out, particularly if it's low traffic, where you might be looking after it, provides the fulcrum from which you're in your bit of the world, your place, your home, but it's easy to speak to your passing neighbour or someone living around the corner. Another one, and I think this is the last one, so I won't keep giving you too much of a 101 course on urban design, please forgive me. Traditional block patterns really matter. ones with clear backs and fronts, as you can see here. They're associated with lower crime because basically it's very hard to break into the front of a house, but actually you can't really get round to the back because it's enclosed within an urban block. You can't really get in there either. They're also associated with children playing more outside, particularly young children. So young children, on the whole, won't be going to play in the public space. They'll be playing in a back garden. So creating lots of back gardens very tightly through terraced houses. Or if you do create public space, as you can see in the green square on the left of that image, doing it in a way that is well overlooked by front doors linked to windows surrounding it. Again, that associates with lower crime. And when you've got a network like this as well of streets with multiple points, it's also associated with multiple ways of getting from A to B, and thus with more walking or cycling. So all this is to say that place matters. Sorry, there is one more one on this. This is one where I annoy architects, but I don't care. These are two different buildings in the same part of a town in the west coast of the States. The chap who did this got students to pretend to be lost tourists in front of these two buildings. 5 times as many random passers-by spontaneously offered to help the spuriously lost tourists in front of the building on the left versus building on the right, with similar multiples offering to lend them their phone or lead them to their destination. Now, I know the guy who did this report research, and he subsequently admitted to me when I was having a drink with him a couple of years ago, that one of the lost tourists ended up marrying the member of the public who had tried to help her, which is against all social research. You shouldn't do that. Shouldn't have happened. It's bad. But anyway, it improves the point. And by the way, she was in front of the building on the left. The economics of place have changed a lot, our understanding it. So when economists first started thinking about this, 18th century, it was purely a function of distance to market, distance to food, distance to jobs. But what thinkers like Richard Florida, Edward Glaser, others have started to do is to show that actually place attraction matters in terms of the value that people will pay to live or work in a certain place. Next slide, please. Because we obviously have more choice. And then this is from a study we did a few years ago. We looked at every single property sale in 6 British cities. I'm just bringing up the one for London. I apologize, I should probably brought up another one. But I won't go into detail on statistics because I'll take too long. But each of these bar charts on the left, adjusting for everything else, and we were able to use big data on pretty much everything, is the value premium or dispremium associated with a certain quality. So if you can imagine 2 properties immediately next to each other, don't worry about the flat versus house stuff. That would be a distraction from the conversation we're trying to have. But just putting out that first little red line, if you can imagine 2 identical properties in the same part of London, and one of them is surrounded by an above average number of pre-1900 properties and the other isn't. In 2016, the property that was surrounded by high numbers of pre-1900 properties would have had a £58,397 premium based on every sale. Similarly, if it had, actually, it's the next one down, a higher intersection density, which is a measure of a traditional street pattern, that was associated with a £57,000 uplift. So this isn't just what people say or how they behave, it's also what they will pay to live in places. I'll jump over these because I think I've been going on for too long, but just if it's helpful, on the Create Streets website, we've got the books and the videos on this, and we try and put it together into this and the next slide, if you just go to that, please, Ben, which try and summarize some of those things. I haven't gone through all of them because it would take too long. Right, that's my first point. Sorry, that was a bit longer than it was meant to be. Second point, I promise this will be quicker. Go to the next slide, please, Ben. So we work with we've done lots of research and work on lots of levelling up strategies in different parts of the country. And too often, we, by which I mean civic society, are not caring about or thinking about place quality or the beauty of the places that we create or steward. You've all read by now the quote in front of you, but this was an urban designer giving evidence to the Building Beautiful Commission, which I chaired a few years ago. And that's clearly perverse as an outcome to get to that point. So we have to re-legitimize caring about places, particularly less prosperous places, because what you see consistently in every town and city, and again, Lucy touched on this, you get selection effects. So the more prosperous people tend to prioritize living in and dominating certain areas, which yes tend to be better connected, but they also tend to be nicer places and more beautiful and greener places to live in. So this is actually I'll jump over this. These are some of the projects we're currently working in Sunderland and Grimsby and Rochdale and Girvan in Scotland elsewhere. Next slide, please. So this is how we think about it. I'm not saying this is perfect. I'm not saying you should think about it this way, but if it's helpful, this is how we get to it. So when we're working with councils or landowners, we always try and say, look, don't try and do everything yourself. Enable change. Make it easy for many people to be the author of improving the place and making people want to live or work or bring up children there. Seek to set this virtuous circle of change going. There'll be different ways you do that in different places. Set out a vision which recognises that place is emotional as well as logical. One of the things that most annoys me is when developers or councils say, oh, the NIMBYs are just being emotional. Well, of course they are. Place is emotional. It's your home. And very clearly, the longer you have lived in a place, the more emotional you are about the place that you live in. So, that's a good thing that we can work with. Prioritize and sequence ways of improving it, and then be tactically opportunistic within this framework. And we think in places in terms of a green place to live, a safe and healthy place to live, good and affordable new homes, access to purposeful work, and a place in which you want to live, to run a business, to work for business, to work for the public sector, to bring up your children. Easy to be proud of. People want to be proud of their homes, they know, or their neighbourhoods, and worthy of visiting. Where you come in different places will obviously vary from place to place. Next slide, please. This is an example of I could have brought up dozens, but although it's not in a left behind place, inverted commas, it's one that's now fully public, so it was easy to share with you. We recently rewrote Surrey's street design code, and I think it's fair to say, I managed to do so without the sort of level of some of the sort of political pushback that other places are now seeing. And what that has done, I hope, is make it much easier and more predictable for house builders, developers, landowners, and indeed the district councils themselves to create streets or steward existing streets in ways that will, we believe, provably associate with knowing more neighbours, with more active travel, and with cleaner air and healthier places. Next slide, please. Again, I won't, there are hundreds of pages of it, so you'll be relieved I'm not going to go through detail. But by thinking about the way we design streets, as here, more street trees, segregated pavements, modest front gardens, on-street parking broken up by trees in build-outs, we can create streets that are more provably more neighbourly. That is something that every council could do. There are good downloadable forms out there. The Office of Place, which is the new government non-departmental public body, which I now chair, we're creating available online a downloadable series of online codes. So this will get easier and easier to do. At the moment, I think it's probably fair to say it's the councils that are sort of out in front doing it. Here's another example of a really actually quite easy thing to do, creating a continuous footway across a side road to make it easier for people to walk. Next slide, please. Paula, you've come on screen. Does that mean you want me to be quiet?
No, I was just going to ask if you can wrap up, Nicholas. As fascinating as your content is, and it really is, I just want to allow time for
no, quite right. Forgive me. I'm sorry, I talk too much.
No,
jump over. You'll have to not know about the French Village, and you'll have to not know about Norwich. If you just jump over the next 2 slides, please. So you're going to miss that one. And my final point, as I say, I'm not going to go through everything, Paula. You'll be delighted to know. These 3 reports that we worked on, one of them indeed with Karbon Homes, all of which are downloadable, and one we're about to publish actually later this month. If one of you wanted to come to the launch, you'd be hugely welcome. It's on the 26th of September in Coin Street, looking at greening up. And if you just go to the next slide, so that does the detail, which I'm not going to try and go through now. But there is no one simple answer to this, and I'm certainly not pretending there is. These are the 6 themes I think I tried to pull out thinking about this talk. There are dozens of things you could do under each of those, but in each of them, it's about making it easier to do the right thing. So key one, if we move from the way we traffic model, from predict and provide, assuming traffic will go up forever, to setting out a vision or validate, that will make it easier to stop wasting millions and millions on unnecessary new dual carriageway infrastructure and put it into place investment. We're actually working on a couple of sites on that right now. I've said in the south of the country, not the north. So I think that's an easy, there are no easy wins. That's a win. Setting out a clear hierarchy of street types in DFT regulation, and then giving parish councils, residents and community and other groups the right to green up some types of streets in some circumstances. That would allow us to re-green much of our urban framework in the way that it used to be, by the way, until it's degreened over the last 100 years. Reforming and simplifying town centre business rates so that we're not essentially incentivising drive-to box land on the outside. Strengthening community rights by detail on that. Definitely coming back to the earlier conversation, thinking about the retrofit of places on an area-wide basis where you get massive economies of scale, and you can also link that then into place improvements. And we hopefully will have a project of that nature coming in Liverpool soon. Finally, and absolutely very, very importantly, Homes England has been very, very focused just on new homes. Nothing wrong with doing that. But actually, their strategy has now changed. That hasn't yet gone through to all their KPIs and their stewardship and other funds, but really focusing where Homes England puts its money and looking at the green book way that the Treasury looks at dynamic effects of place improvement. Because at the moment, the Treasury finds it very, very hard to accept the economic case for improvements in left behind places. That's the sort of places where Lucy and Karbon Homes are working. They're sort of moving in the right direction, but they keep needing a push, and a body such as yours could give them that push. Paula, that's it. I'm sorry for speaking too long. I'm done.
Thank you. No apology necessary. It was absolutely fascinating. And once again, please feel free to pop anything in the chat or email anything to the email address that Ben has helpfully put in the chat that we may wish to consider as we move into the sprint stage of the inquiry. Okay, I see that we've also been joined by one of our other commissioners, Geoffrey Matsu. So welcome this morning, Geoffrey. And I wonder if any of our commissioners would like to ask any questions before we move on to some of the pre-submitted questions that we have. So if we start with Neil, yeah, and then Geoffrey, please.
You'll be pleased to know I'm already unmuted. I think we've had some really interesting presentations there. I was going to make 3 brief points. Nicholas has been describing what you really find in Rotterdam, which is really interesting design of communities, enabling those sort of street spaces to exist. Rotterdam, incidentally, benefits from a national planning policy going downwards rather than local stuff going upwards. And I just make that point because I think Rotterdam is a fantastic example of the sort of community styles and street styles that Nicholas has mentioned, and we might do well to visit there if we have the resources to do so. That's my first point. My second one is really about Lucy's presentation, because I think the big problem really is economic activity or lack of in places like Byker. Because again, I happen to know Byker quite well. The question I think the Commission needs to focus on is what we do about the generation of economic activity. Because she said it herself, this deindustrialization caused all the difficulties. Well, yes, it has. And the consequences actually just don't have anything to do, which is economically productive. That's the problem. So our thrust must be not just to create the homes and spaces which people want to live in, but actually they want to work nearby and can work nearby. And I'm just wondering what Lucy's thinking about in terms of how that might be done in Byker. I think the place in Durham, which Coley, was it? Did you mention? If there's any sort of thoughts there about how you can bring that economic activity about. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. Would any of the panelists like to respond to that?
Yeah, I can. Thanks very much, Neil, for those comments. Absolutely. I think, when we did a lot of the research, the economic inactivity in the 2 areas we're working in was high for a number of reasons. Sometimes it was generations of worklessness, poor transport links, a lack of jobs locally, a lack of thriving businesses locally. So what we've tried to do is tackle that on a number of fronts. So both working with individuals, people who live there, in terms of increasing their skills and their ability to search for it and attract work. But the bit that I think we haven't done before as a housing association is to really try and strengthen that local economy. So there are jobs that are local, so people can walk to them. So looking at things like, in Stan, we've bought this very large building that dominates the high street that's been derelict. There's loads of opportunities for that. That could be about business incubation, so helping people to think about very small scale businesses and using that space for that. That can be about it could be a commercial business that sets up in there as well as residential areas to live. And our other piece of work that we've done is this scheme called New Start, which I mentioned, which was about talking to local businesses. How can you grow? And one of the things they wanted to do was to employ local people and to enable them to grow their business, but they couldn't afford to, and they particularly couldn't afford to do that with some of the people who live locally, because they just didn't have the skills and they didn't have the time and the money to invest in those skills. So by giving this 5 months pay, they could get people up to the speed that they would need to be to really make a contribution to the business. But they were also, employing someone locally who can then go back and spend money in the area. So we had, I think, about 70 something percent success rate of getting people who were in those placements into long-term employment, either within those businesses or within surrounding businesses. So it's not easy, it's quite labour intensive, but we, believe by really focusing on that hyper-local area, the research we did, we we really try to map and understand what's in the area and what needs to be in the area in terms of that foundational economy, in terms of those goods and services that people need access to, and what our role could be in improving that. We can't do everything alone, so we do work in partnership with local authorities, and there's a place for, you know, small business investment, there's a place for local authority employability support, but we wanted to see what we could actually do to create more prosperity in those areas.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Lucy.
Thank you. Yeah.
Jeffrey, would you like to come in, or Jeff?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the insightful presentations. Nicholas, you had some really interesting slides highlighting a number of benefits that derive out of not just the buildings themselves, but how they're configured in different sort of neighborhoods and formats. I was wondering, how does government quantify and measure some of these values? Because you've noticed, I mean, you noted across a number of your slides a lot of these benefits, but obviously to then develop these communities, you sort of need to be able to create justifications of all of these values that, you know, come up. And you mentioned Green Book as well, and the economic case, but there's also the strategic case that's often looked before the economic case. And how do you sort of keep at the forefront the strategic case when evaluating the economic case? Because sometimes that falls to the wayside. So sort of two questions for you.
Thank you, Jeff. I think I understood them. It may be too difficult for me. I'll do the best I can. So I think on the, I may be kidding myself here, perhaps I am. I think on the planning side, it's got better in the last few years. Now, I would say that because I've been trying to make it better for the last few years, so I might not be disinterested in saying that. But you know, genuinely, there are now, as planning lawyers say, hooks in the national planning policy framework and in some of the subsidiary guidance that do set a much clearer quality ask than historically we have. So, you know, I think there have been genuine steps in the right direction there. That's not yet percolating through locally, as you would expect. And there are all sorts of other challenges. To come to the meat of your question, though, on Treasury Green Book and investment decisions, I mean, look, it's, I think there are two answers. One is, I mean, the Treasury has, and I'm not an economist, but the Treasury has conceded the key point, which is that you can have place-specific effects. They just still don't like taking account of it. And so there is now an ability within the Green Book to do this. It just doesn't seem to happen much. So I think, you know, there's detailed work, publishing case studies, showing consequences, working with Treasury officials to make that happen. I think that's point one. I think the easier answer, because that is against Treasury brain. I'm sorry if you're a former Treasury civil servant, I'm being rude. Are you? I don't know. I'd assume not, but maybe you are. Secondly, I think is to take proxies. So you can take KPIs for good outcomes that are likely to associate with more value and more investment and indeed more jobs. So, you know, how much people walk, how many of your neighbours you know, mental health locally. There is now quite a lot of local data available. In fact, that's how some of this research gets done, because you've got very local data on mental health. So you could imagine a situation where, you know, KPIs. I mean, I've been arguing so far, not fully successfully, that every local council, essentially their chief planner should be a chief placemaker, and he or she, you could imagine, you know, nationwide, there were a series of metrics in terms of canopy cover, level of local mental health, levels of walking, levels of place satisfaction. All these things are very doable. Some of them exist already. Some actually, with my office place add-on, I'm starting to create. So you could imagine a situation where, you know, you start to create a, it doesn't necessarily need to be sort of political in the sort of, you know, blue versus red version, but a sort of soft political, you know, there's politics between chief executives of councils, isn't there? So, you know, she's better than him or whatever. So if you started getting a bit more of that, and hopefully the Office of Place will start pushing for a bit of that and start seeing that actually some of these investments are relatively modest compared to some of the big picture stuff. And then seeing how you can count through that in terms of air quality, number of street trees, that type of thing. So I would use a mixture of Green Book and then simpler metrics, because realistically, I think you'll need both. So there's a slightly nebulous answer. There's detail on the Green Book answer that I can't spontaneously talk to, but the if you look at the case for place that we did with Karbon, that goes into 10 paragraphs on that.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for the question.
Committed the cardinal sin of speaking on mute there. Do we have any further questions from our commissioner? Jeff, from our commissioners, Jeff or Neil, would you like to come back before we move on to some of our pre-submitted questions? Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to select a few questions from the list that we had that were pre-submitted. So if any of our panelists would like to respond to these. So question from Stacey, and she asks, with the increase of housing shortages, lack of resources in service provision, how realistic will the levelling up tackle the issue, and what provision or steps are there towards making priority for a realistic outcome? Does anybody want to respond to that one, or is it more helpful if I
is that a lack of resources in terms of skilled employment, or something else? Because I think in terms of housing shortages, we do actually have to get to grips with the labour market shortages in construction. And notwithstanding Nicholas's excellent point about ILCA, modular, I wouldn't be here sort of fossilising today if I didn't actually believe it. But it does offer a way forward, not just in terms of housing, but also in terms of commercial and municipal. It's important to remember that there are various different types of modular offered various different types of offers and opportunities to use it. But what it does provide is for greater productivity and greater use of the skills market we have. If we want to increase our housing stock, if we want to tackle the housing shortages issue at root, then we really have to address that as a matter of priority.
Okay, thank you. Tammy has asked, what is going to be done to address the gulf between the LHA and market rents and the lack of new landlords joining the market to increase opportunity to rent privately?
That's supply.
Yeah,
supply issue.
Yeah, I could. Sorry, go on, Daniel. I'll come after you.
Not to be overly simplistic, but it is a supply issue, and unless we address the supply issue, I live in Buckinghamshire, a place called Chesham. It's pretty leafy, it's pretty nice. People move out there because they can't afford to live in central London or on the end of the Metropolitan line. Some people, I beg your pardon, choose to live out there because they can't afford to live in central London. It's on the end of the Metropolitan line, I should say. But we're finding now that there are families locally that they can't afford to rent their properties, and that's a supply issue. We need to increase the supply in order to bring the prices down. Lucy, sorry, you were going to comment.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you. I think the answer is, and I would say this as a housing association, the answer is to provide more social housing, more affordable housing. So we've seen, the LHA rates. I think something I saw recently said they only cover the 18% of the cheapest rents rather than the 30% they were meant to do. And that means in so many areas, people just have a massive gap between what they're being charged in the private rental sector and what they can afford. And what the benefit covers. And, the answer to this is to invest in building a lot more social housing, that's genuinely affordable, in order to enable people to live in those areas. Where we're based in the North Eastern Yorkshire, in the past, we've, tended to say there's been less of an issue with this, but in many of the areas we're working in, that they are, becoming genuinely unaffordable. So it's affecting everyone all around the country. But yeah, I just keep coming back to the answer is to invest in building more affordable homes, and the next government, whichever flavour it is, that really needs to look at that. And adding to that, I think in some areas looking at conversion of private rented homes into social homes. If we can't build them from scratch, then look at actually converting some areas where there's just been housing market failure and social housing doesn't exist. There are huge amounts of poor quality private rented homes. Then look at policies that can enable that conversion to take place on a wider scale, a bit like they've started doing in Blackpool, I think.
I understand.
Just really quickly to come back, Lucy. It's the genuine affordability as well. It's not just 80% of that local market value. It's the affordability of living in your home, living in the place that you choose to live, that you call home. If you can't afford to heat it, then you are not living in it, you are simply existing in it.
Yeah, absolutely. Neil, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I just think this question of supply is a really important one, because of course we all know that it takes many more years for somebody to rent a house, because basically we just simply do not have enough houses. Now the question is, which houses do we build, and where do we build them? And I think Lucy's right to emphasise on social housing, but of course the truth is house builders don't like building social housing, and we've got to find a way of incentivising them to do exactly that. And we also need to make sure that there's more sort of mixed of making sure that people can learn from each other and generate that economic activity which I was talking about before. So what I'd like to hear is what do we think we should be doing about creating the economic drivers to build the houses where they need to be built, bearing in mind that since our idiotic decision to leave the European Union, we're going to be finding it a lot harder to expand the economy going forward. And I think that's a real challenge that kind of underpin some of the discussions that we are having.
Can I come in on that one quickly, please,
Yeah.
Paula?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. So look, I mean, the nature of the housing challenge we face is different in different parts of the country, and I think we all know that, but it does need emphasising. So if you look at unmet demand measured through house prices, and as I think Paula said right at the start, we do have, and it underpins your whole commission, a very, very unbalanced economy with huge, almost infinite in mathematical terms, demand in London and some other places around Cambridge, bits of the southeast, and in a few other hotspots. I don't quite disagree with what Lucy, maybe I do, but I don't think I quite disagree with what Lucy was saying earlier, but maybe I do, I'm not sure. But the issues in much of the rest of the country, with some important exceptions, are ones of productivity and prosperity rather than supply of housing per se. That's not to say there won't be supply pressures in some places, there are, but it's about income rather than overall quantum of usable property. It's not to say we shouldn't necessarily be doing some building or improving some places. So I think it's important to make that distinction. The reason we don't have enough homes in the south, which is relevant to a debate on levelling up, even though it's not quite centre ground, Daniel touched on this, and I touched on it right at the start, is that we choose to run our planning system in a very odd way with high levels of planning risk. So to come back to Chesham, just because Daniel mentioned it, weirdly, we got a project in Chesham, and as some of you will recall, Chesham had a by-election a couple of years ago, which you may remember. The good voters of Chesham were not prepared to accept a situation in which about 900 homes would be put on the nearby greenbelt. So we've got to find ways in which that is put acceptably in the local plan in more of the southeast, so we take some of the pressure off the high prices. But outside the southeast and a few other places, we through a combination of infrastructure, investment, and place improvement, all three are necessary. We've got to have more people wanting to live and work there. Social housing is part of that, but so also is market housing. One of the sites we're working on, I mean, not on Lucy's patch, but not that far away, there's loads of social housing, there's no market housing, and there are no jobs in the town centre. The town has ceased to play its centrifugal function as a place where people wish to come to live, to work, to invest, and to come together as men and women, for commercial or personal purposes. So that focus on place quality is absolutely crucial. By the way, there are lots of dual carriageways going to this town, I've got in mind. I probably better not say what it is, this is public. Lots of dual carriageways. You can get there very easily. And there's a train that goes to London. The problem is no one wants to be there. And not enough people want to create jobs there, because given the choice, they'll go and do it somewhere else. So place quality does come in there more directly, in my view, than supply per se. Though that's not to say that building new homes is not part of the answer. So I think there is a nature difference between the challenge at extremes in different parts of the country. I hope that's helpful and not too provocative. And I hope Lucy doesn't. I'm trying to disagree. I'm not trying to disagree with all my fellow panelists just to be provocative. I hope it's not said in that spirit, at any rate.
Thank you. I think this is a subject that we could probably discuss for several hours. But that concludes.
My God, I've been doing this for years, Paula. I could do more than hours.
Absolutely. That concludes our session, our second panel this morning. So thank you to Lucy, to Daniel and to Nicholas for your brilliant participation and very thought-provoking presentations this morning. So again, if you want to stay for our final panel, please feel free to do so. But if you do need to leave, we do understand. And
thank you.
Ben pops the email address in the chat. So anything else that you'd like to send, any reports or any other comments or observations or reflections, please feel free to do so. Thank you very much.